Hi ladies, my name is Alina Gothier and I attend New Life Westland with my husband Chris. And I am so excited to enter into Isaiah over these next 2 months as we study it together. Now, a few months ago, Megan Haugen gave us a beautiful introduction into Genesis, the creation of the world and beginnings of God's promise to the nation of Israel. Megan told us how Genesis ends with Joseph's words to his brothers and the 12 tribes, "God will surely visit you." The book closes with a sign of hope, not only for the eventual exodus out of Egypt, but also for a grander visitation, that of the Messiah. Isaiah continues this thread of hope that we see through the Bible in his message of ultimate fulfillment of the promise and redemption of Israel in the Messiah. After Joseph's death in Genesis, the Israelites become slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Then God sends Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, and after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness for their lack of faith, he finally gives them the land he promised Abraham. They cycle in following God and falling away from him through the periods of Judges until they demand a king. After Saul, God anoints David. And after David's son Solomon, the kingdom is divided into two, Israel and Judah. Though prophets are active at this time as the voice of God to Israel and Judah, for the most part, the kings don't follow the Lord, and the people become more and more disobedient to him. This is the land in which God brings forth Isaiah the prophet. Now, we don't know too much about Isaiah. We know that he's the son of Amos, the brother of King Uzziah or Azariah, making him of royal blood. And we know that he prophesies to Judah during the reign of his uncle and the three following kings, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. We also know that his name means Yahweh is salvation, which is a hint to his glorious purpose and message. And we know his title of prophet. Now, in the Old Testament, there are a few basic terms for prophet, the most generic ones just basically meaning a fortune teller or a seer. But biblical prophets, prophets of Yahweh the Most High, were more than that. They were raised up by God for a specific purpose in time, and their emphasis was not so much telling the future, though they did that, but it was rather giving instruction to how what they saw influenced the way people lived in the present. God's prophets were distinguished in that they spoke his words, proclaimed faith in him to the people, and they knew their abilities didn't come from themselves, but from God. Because we know Isaiah is a prophet, that clues us right into what kind of literature we're reading, prophecy. In fact, it's the first major prophet that we come into contact with in the Bible. Now, prophetic reading is kind of tricky. Out of all the literary styles in the Bible, it's the one I struggle with the most because it's really confusing and complex at times. But if you have the right tools and information, it's a lot easier to break down. For starters, know that prophetic reading is not like historical reading. We just finished reading Genesis, a fairly easy read. Stories, genealogies, it's pretty clear and pretty chronological. But prophetic reading isn't usually like that. There's more symbolism, a lack of linear storyline, and lots of bouncing back and forth between themes. Often prophecy will also be written in poetic form, which informs us not to take those sections too literally, but search the text for implicit or indirect meaning. Next, it's important to note some of the historical context surrounding Isaiah. To whom was it originally written? When was it written? And what was happening in the world at that time? Isaiah's message is directed toward the people of Israel, but more specifically the kingdom of Judah, during the mid to early 700s. The book is written over several decades and spans the political and social issues of several kings, and because it's prophecy, it also deals with things that happen in the future, so far ahead as the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BC and the birth of Christ 700 years later. So, needless to say, it can be a bit confusing knowing who Isaiah is talking to or addressing at different points in the book. But there are a few major historical events that we can use as landmarks in our reading. The first is the conflict between Israel and the nation of Syria and Assyria in 735 BC. Judah is being pressured to take a side in this conflict. Now, Assyria is this great global power at the time, and rather than trusting in God to keep Judah safe, King Ahaz is seduced by Assyria's power and joins them as an ally. For a short time this works, but 30 years later, Assyria destroys Syria and Israel and becomes a threat themselves. That's our second historical landmark, which you can read about in the account of 2 Kings 18 through 20. It's now 701 BC, 30 years later, during King Hezekiah's reign, and Assyria threatens to completely annihilate Judah. Hezekiah also doubts God's ability to save his people, but he has a brief moment of clarity where he prays to God and is delivered. But even though Hezekiah sees God's power firsthand, he still falls prey to the temptation of wealth and power of kings. and shows Babylon, Jerusalem's vulnerabilities, which ultimately leads to the fall of Judah, the destruction of Jerusalem, and Israel's captivity to Babylon in the 500s BC. Now, when we look at the structure of the book, we see chapters 1 through 39 give warnings and prophecies of these nations, Assyria and Babylon, intertwined with hopeful messianic prophecy. In the later half of the book, chapters 40 through 66, Isaiah shifts his focus a little bit to a perspective of a futuristic one. This part of the book takes on a different quality, as though it's written after the exile, which wouldn't come for another 130 years. It contains messages of hope, that the exile was not God's neglect of Israel, but rather judgment and punishment for their sins, and that God is raising up a new servant to restore Israel and be a light to the nations through a sacrifice of atonement. He ends with a message that the wicked will face God's judgment, but his servants will inherit the New Jerusalem. So we've got poetry, we've got prophecy, we've got decades and centuries of events happening. This creates a book with a unique and structurally complex design. But the message through all these fascinating twists and turns is fairly simple. God's cleansing touch atones for sin through judgment, but he's ultimately moving history forward to the blessing of his people and all people through the Messiah, Jesus Christ. It's a twofold message of judgment and hope, and the whole book portrays God's plan for Judah to produce the final Davidic heir, the holy seed who will grow from the charred stump of Israel, who will bring light not only to Israel, but to the whole world. As you read in Isaiah these next 2 months, I hope you leave prepared and excited to learn more about Isaiah's warnings to the people of Israel and see how God is the ultimate orchestrator of history. And I pray you're encouraged and reminded that God's heart is for his people. And though he is a just God, he's also full of mercy and love.